Listen, I'm Jess, and I'm here to tell you about a man who became invisible by design and almost died because of it. Not the man, the patient. The man who could understand him, he was always invisible, and that invisibility almost cost a life. It was 3:47 in the morning at County Hospital in Portland. The kind of hour where the world feels like it's operating on fumes. The night shift is the shift nobody wants. The doctors are tired. The nurses are running on cold coffee and caffeine pills. The hospital seems less like a place of healing and more like a place where people keep themselves awake trying to save lives. Everything feels slower. Everything feels heavier. Everything feels like it's happening underwater. The hallways are narrower at this hour. The lights are dimmer. The sounds carry differently. Monitor beeps, ventilator hisses. The soft squeak of shoe rubber on linoleum. It's the hour when you realize hospitals never actually sleep. They just pause. They hold their breath. They wait for the next crisis. That's when the ambulance brought him in. Middle-aged man, chest pain, confusion. The paramedics were talking in clipped sentences as they wheeled him through the ER doors. Vital signs unstable, oxygen saturation down. Something happening in the cardiac electrical system. He was speaking, but not English. He was speaking Arabic, rapid Arabic, the kind of speech that comes from deep inside panic and pain. His words were stumbling over each other. Prayers and fragments and medical observations tangled into one desperate rush. His hands were gripping the stretcher rails so hard the paramedics had to work to move him to the hospital bed. His chest was heaving. His eyes were wide. He was terrified. The ER doctors were moving through their protocol like dancers who'd rehearsed this choreography 1,000 times. IV lines, oxygen, cardiac monitor, blood work. They knew what to do with chest pain. They moved with efficiency. They communicated in shorthand. Get a 12 lead, 2 large bore IVs, page cardiology. They were competent. They were trained. They knew what to do with a language barrier. You get someone to translate. You use hand signals. You slow down. You're patient. But this wasn't a simple barrier. This was a patient in acute distress, speaking a language that nobody in the ER at 3:47 in the morning could understand. The night shift nurse, let's call her Sarah, though that's not her real name. She'd been working doubles for 2 weeks. Her feet hurt. Her eyes were gritty. Her compassion hadn't worn out yet, but it was being tested. She was trying. I need you to understand that. She wasn't dismissive. She wasn't cruel. She was understaffed, overworked, and facing a man who couldn't tell her where it hurt beyond pointing frantically at his chest and his heart and saying things in a language that sounded like prayer and desperation. She was using words. She was using hand signals. She was using her phone to look up hospital protocols for language barriers. She was getting an increasing sense that something critical was being lost in translation. Something important was happening in this man's chest and in his mind. And she couldn't bridge the gap between his fear and her understanding. But she was managing. She was handling it. That's what she thought. The patient kept saying the same words over and over, the same phrases in Arabic. His voice was getting more frantic. Al-Qalb, Al-Qalb, Mada Tafal. Over and over. His breathing was rapid. His oxygen saturation was holding but barely. Sarah was starting to wonder if the agitation was medical, if his heart was deteriorating, or if it was the fear of not being understood. She couldn't tell the difference. That matters. That distinction matters because it determines how you treat him. Do you sedate him to keep him calm? Do you push more cardiac medications? Do you keep trying to communicate? Do you call cardiology? Do you do a cath lab workup? Every decision hinges on understanding what he's actually experiencing. One of the residents was from Pakistan. She spoke Urdu, not Arabic. Close, but not close enough. The patient started speaking faster when she tried, mixing languages, getting more confused. The resident looked at Sarah and shook her head. Not this language. Sarah made a choice. She pulled out her phone. Translation app. She'd used it before. Works pretty well for Spanish. Works okay for Mandarin. She opened the app. Arabic to English. She held the phone toward the patient. Speak, she said. Speak into phone. Phone, help. The patient understood the gesture. He leaned toward the phone. His voice was hoarse. He was gripping the bed rail with his other hand. The app listened. The app processed. The neural networks that had been trained on thousands of hours of Arabic audio tried to decode what this specific man, with this specific accent and this specific panic, was trying to communicate. The app did its best. The translation said, Chaplain, prayer, heart stopping, before medicine, before now. Chaplain here. Sarah stared at the translation. It was garbage. It was fragments. It was like the algorithm had understood every fifth word. But it was enough to tell Sarah that he was asking for a chaplain. And maybe he was asking for spiritual comfort. Maybe he was asking for something else entirely. She didn't know. Here's the thing, and pay attention to this detail because it matters later. The translation algorithm doesn't know context. It doesn't know that when someone's chest is collapsing and they're speaking in their native language because English has abandoned them, they might be saying something medically critical. It doesn't know the weight of what's really being said. The patient was still speaking, but nobody could hear what he was actually saying. The algorithm had turned his urgency into noise. Sarah looked at the attending physician. I think he's asking for spiritual support, she said. The attending nodded. It made sense. Patients in crisis often want spiritual comfort. It's natural. It's human. It could also be a sign of acceptance, that he'd already decided his heart was failing and he wanted to prepare spiritually. Sarah called the chaplain. Hospital protocol. She left a message. Chaplain needed an ER Arabic-speaking patient. Acute MI concern, requesting spiritual support. The chaplain was on call. The chaplain checked his message. The chaplain said he'd come down. ETA 10 minutes. Sarah turned back to the patient. She pointed at herself. Nurse, she said. She pointed at the monitor. Your heart. She made a thumbs up. Okay? Doctor, help. Chaplain, come, okay? The patient shook his head. He wasn't rejecting the idea. He was refusing to wait. He was saying something urgent, something that couldn't wait for the chaplain to arrive. His face was anguished. His words were becoming more desperate. La, ana atik dawa taks halbadi. Some ana. The attending came over. Do we have any resources for Arabic interpretation? Sarah shook her head. At 3:47 in the morning, in a hospital that served a significant Middle Eastern immigrant community, they didn't have an Arabic interpreter on call. They had a contract with a translation service. It was 20 minutes away minimum, not available. The patient's agitation was increasing. His heart rate on the monitor was climbing. 94, 98, 103, 110. The medical team was watching. The attending was thinking. The resident was thinking. The nurses were thinking. The decision was forming in the room like humidity before a storm. If he didn't calm down, they were going to need to sedate him. His elevated heart rate in the context of chest pain and possible MI. It was dangerous. Sedation was looking more necessary by the second. The attending turned to Sarah. Have we considered sedation? It wasn't a casual question. It was a decision being presented as an option. Sarah hesitated. Sedation is a tool. It's sometimes necessary. But it's also a wall that goes up between the patient and communication. It's unconsciousness in a moment when consciousness might be the only thing keeping someone's medical history intact. Once they sedated him, he'd be unconscious. Whatever he was trying to tell them would stay unsaid. Whatever critical information was locked in his Arabic-speaking mind would remain locked. They'd have to treat him based on what they could figure out. The vitals, the EKG, the lab work. No context. Sarah said, "Give him a few more minutes. Let me try one more thing." That's when the janitor stopped mopping outside the door. His name was Marcus, though nobody at the hospital knew that because nobody asked. He'd been working the night shift for 3 years, 5 months and 17 days. He knew every hallway. He knew where the squeaky wheel was on cart C. He knew which bathroom on the second floor would flood if the water pressure spiked. He knew the exact rhythm of the night shift. When the ER got busy, when the ICU quieted down, when the 3 a.m. crisis hour hit. He knew every corner of the hospital's physical space and none of its human space. He was the kind of invisible that happens when you're competent and quiet and you keep to yourself. The kind of invisible where people look through you instead of at you. Marcus was mid-40s. Lean. Not thin, lean. The kind of body that comes from military discipline maintained long after military service ends, long after you've stopped believing in the reason you maintained it in the first place. His uniform was always pressed, not ostentatiously, just properly. His shoes were always clean, his hands were always steady. But there was something about the set of his shoulders that suggested he'd carried weight. Something about the way his eyes moved, methodical, scanning, taking in exits and positions and what was happening in the peripheral vision, that suggested training nobody at County Hospital had asked about. He was, in every way that mattered, unremarkable. That was by design. He'd been mopping the third-floor hallway for 40 minutes, working his way toward the stairs in the systematic pattern he'd developed over 3 years, 5 months, and 17 days. Every square foot of floor. No section missed, no spot overlooked. The rhythm of it was meditative. The motion was the same every night. The only variable was the sounds that came from the rooms he passed. He'd heard patients speak during the night shift before. He'd heard crying. He'd heard prayers in English. He'd heard the ragged breathing of someone in pain. He'd heard families whispering outside rooms. He'd heard the medication cart rattling as nurses distributed pills and IV bags. He'd heard the white noise of hospital machines keeping people alive. Ventilators, monitors, infusion pumps, oxygen concentrators. He'd heard all of it, without comment, without attention, without breaking his pace. But this was different. As he approached the ER corridor, he heard Arabic, rapid Arabic, the kind of speech that comes from somewhere deep, not from the front of the mouth where English lives, but from the back of the throat where older languages, mother languages, panic languages live. The cadence was familiar. The urgency was unmistakable. The accent was Syrian or Lebanese or Jordanian, one of the dialects that grows different roots depending on which desert or mountain it's spoken in. Marcus set down his mop, not carefully, not dramatically. He just set it down. The handle made a soft sound against the linoleum, and he walked toward the patient room. He didn't announce himself. He didn't knock. He didn't think. He just moved toward the Arabic like something magnetic was pulling him toward it. He appeared in the doorway. Blue janitor's uniform, slightly wet mop handle still in hand from habit. Eyes that had changed in a way that nobody in that room had ever seen before, because nobody in that room had ever seen Marcus as anything other than a figure in a uniform. The patient saw him and stopped speaking mid-word. Sarah turned. The resident doctor turned. The attending physician turned. The entire room shifted focus. All of them looking at this man in a janitor's uniform, standing in the doorway, like he'd just materialized from the walls. Like he'd been waiting in the hospital infrastructure for this moment. Marcus met the patient's eyes. And then he spoke. In Arabic. Not tentatively. Not like he was searching for words or trying to remember something he'd learned once. Like he lived there. Like he'd spent years in that language. Like Arabic was a place he'd inhabited and understood the geography of. He said, Ana huna, anta amin, kullas mada tahtaj. I'm here. You're safe. Tell me what you need. The effect was immediate. The patient's shoulders dropped. His hands stopped gripping the bed rail. His breathing, which had been short and panicked and rapid, became deeper, more controlled. He started speaking in Arabic to Marcus, and as he spoke, his voice changed. It became less frantic, more organized, like someone who could finally speak the truth that his body held, the context that his mind was desperate to communicate. Marcus listened. He nodded. His face showed understanding. His body showed attention, leaning in slightly, hands still, eyes focused. He asked questions in Arabic. When did this start? Have you taken medication today? What medications? When was the previous heart attack? His questions were precise, medical. Someone who knew what information mattered. And as he listened, as he translated the chaos of a patient's terror into the structured language of medical history, his own face changed. Something in him, something that had been compressed and managed and locked down for 3 years, 5 months and 17 days, surfaced for just a moment. Recognition. The recognition of someone who understood what this patient was carrying. The recognition of someone who remembered why he'd learned this language in the first place. The recognition of being needed. Look, this is the moment in the story where everything pivots. This is where invisible becomes visible. This is where the night shift realizes that the man they've been walking past every night for 3 years is not who they thought he was. The man they didn't know had a name. The patient was speaking faster now, the words tumbling over each other. The fear still there, but different. Fear that someone understood now, fear that was becoming information instead of just noise. Marcus listened. He nodded. He asked a clarifying question. Verapamil? The patient nodded frantically. Yes, Verapamil. Marcus's face went very still. He turned to Sarah. He spoke in English now, and his accent carried the weight of another education underneath. An education that happened in classrooms and compounds and forward operating bases in places with different sky. He spoke with precision. He had a heart attack 3 years ago. At home, not in a hospital. He was on Verapamil. He's on Verapamil right now. He's been telling you people he has chest pain, and you've been listening, and the translation app has been failing. And what he's actually been trying to say is, don't give me anything that will interact with the Verapamil. I'm terrified you're going to give me something that will stop my heart. That's what the before medicine means. He had a heart attack before, and the medicine saved his life. And now his chest is hurting again, and he's terrified that if you give him the wrong thing, the medication he's already taking will kill him. Sarah's face went white. Not in anger. In realization. In the slow motion understanding of what almost happened. Marcus continued. He's not asking for a chaplain. Well, he is. He was asking for the chaplain because he thought he was dying, because he thought nobody understood, because he thought you were going to give him something that would interact with his medication, and he wanted someone to pray with him before that happened. He's not panicked about his heart giving out. He's panicked about a medication interaction. He's panicked because the man speaking English to him and the machines beeping around him all speak a language he can't navigate. And the algorithm in your phone turned his medical history into noise. The attending physician didn't hesitate. His eyes went to the computer terminal. He pulled up the patient's medication list. There it was. Verapamil, calcium channel blocker, listed on the intake form in the patient's shaky handwriting. And somewhere in the chaos of a 3:47 in the morning ER admission, the patient speaking Arabic, the nurses using translation apps, the resident trying to get a history in a language barrier, the monitors alarming, the adrenaline of possible MI. Somewhere in all of that, nobody had connected the dots. Nobody had flagged that this patient's current presentation of chest pain, in the context of him already being on a beta blocker alternative, needed careful medication selection. The attending had been thinking about giving him a particular medication combination to manage the chest pain and the elevated heart rate. That combination would have compounded with the verapamil. That would have dropped his blood pressure. That would have slowed his heart rate further. That would have potentially pushed him into cardiogenic shock. That would have killed him. Marcus had stopped it with 7 words in Arabic and a translation that gave the medical team the context they'd lost. The context that the algorithm couldn't see. The context that only someone who could speak the patient's native language, who could understand not just the words, but the meaning underneath them, could have retrieved. Jesus, the attending said. He pulled his hands back from the keyboard like the computer had burned him. Jesus, we would have. Yes, Marcus said quietly. You would have. Now look, I need to tell you who Marcus actually was. Because that matters. Because this isn't just about a lucky translation. This is about what it costs to carry a past and not tell anyone about it. My brother served in Afghanistan. 2 tours. He was Army intelligence. He spent 18 months learning to read people, read situations, read the tiny movements that tell you what someone's really thinking. He came home and he couldn't unsee it. He'd walk into a coffee shop and he'd notice exits. He'd hear someone speaking another language and his entire nervous system would activate because that was training. Language recognition, threat assessment, attention that never really turns off. Marcus had served. Army interpreter, Arabic and Pashto and Dari. 14 years, 3 deployments. He'd spent that time in places where language was survival. Where understanding what someone was really saying, not what they were translating, but what they meant beneath the translation, was the difference between keeping people alive and getting them killed. He was good at it. He was so good that he got clearance for classified work. He was interpreting for commanders in the field. He was sitting in rooms where decisions were made that affected hundreds of people. He was the bridge between cultures and strategy and consequence. He was important. And then something happened. That part of the story comes later. But something happened that made him decide he couldn't do that work anymore. Something made him decide that the invisible work had to become even more invisible. That he couldn't carry the weight of what he'd done and who he'd become in the language that had defined him professionally. So he came home. He left the Army. He left interpreting. He left his clearance and his credentials and his resume. And he went to work as a night shift janitor at County Hospital in Portland. And he became the person nobody asked about, because he was the person nobody noticed. For 3 years, 5 months, and 17 days, he mopped hallways, he cleaned bathrooms, he took out trash, he maintained the hospital infrastructure that everyone took for granted. And he didn't use his Arabic. He didn't translate. He didn't bridge language gaps. He just kept his head down and existed in the space between seeing and being seen, until the night shift brought in a patient who was dying because nobody could understand him. Sarah was on her phone immediately after Marcus's translation. She called the attending. She called the pharmacist. They all converged on the patient room. The patient, now calmer, now understood, explained to Marcus what his full medical history was. Marcus translated with precision. The patient had a previous MI 3 years prior. He was on verapamil. He had an allergy to NSAIDs. He'd had a reaction to penicillin that made his throat close. All of that information was critical. All of it was buried beneath the panic and the language barrier and the failed algorithm. The medical team changed their approach. They stopped considering medications that could have compounded his condition. They ordered the right cardiac workup. They gave him the right medications. His EKG showed some changes consistent with an old infarction, but nothing acute. His troponin was slightly elevated. Some damage, but not massive. He was going to live. He was going to live because Marcus stopped mopping. The room had gone very quiet. The attending was pulling up records. Sarah was standing very still. The resident was looking at Marcus like she was trying to recalibrate how she understood him. A janitor. A night shift janitor with a mop had just prevented a medical error that would have killed a patient. A medical error that they, the trained professionals, had been about to make. One of the nurses, older, had worked at the hospital for 15 years, looked at Sarah and said, "How did he?" She didn't finish the question. How did he know? How does the janitor know more than we do? The attending said, "Get me his employment file. I want to know everything about this man." Marcus didn't resist. He didn't run. He didn't say, "I'd rather not." He'd known this was coming the moment he spoke Arabic in that doorway. He'd chosen visibility when he chose to translate. Now he had to live with the consequences of being visible. The hospital pulled his file. They saw his education, a degree in linguistics from Portland State. They called the university. No, he wasn't listed as an alumnus. He was listed as someone who'd completed the coursework but never finished. The university said, his parents came from Lebanon. He was working full-time when he attended. He just stopped coming one semester. Why? Nobody knew. Marcus wouldn't say. Catherine, the hospital administrator, wanted answers. She called him to her office the next morning. Marcus came in his blue uniform. He was off shift. He could have changed. He didn't. "I need to know who you are," Catherine said. And Marcus, sitting in a chair in the hospital administrator's office at 8 in the morning on a day that was starting to feel different, told her about the Army, about the interpreter position, about the classified work, about 3 deployments. He didn't tell her about the thing that had broken him. He didn't tell her about the person who died because of a mistranslation he'd made, or not quite mistranslation, but a translation that had been used in a way he hadn't understood would happen. He just said, "I needed to stop. I needed to work somewhere where nobody asked me anything. This was that place." Catherine listened. When he finished, she said, "That man, Rashid, he'd be dead right now if you weren't mopping floors last night." Marcus said, "Yes." How many other people would have died if they'd come in speaking Arabic? Marcus didn't answer. They both knew the number was more than 0. Now, here's what I need to tell you about who Marcus actually was. Because that matters. Because this isn't just about a lucky translation in a hospital ER at 3:47 in the morning. This is about what it costs to carry a past and not tell anyone about it. This is about the weight of training and language and being useful in ways that cost something to use. My brother served in Afghanistan. 2 tours. He was Army intelligence. He spent 18 months of his first deployment learning to read people, read situations, read the tiny movements in someone's face that tell you what they're really thinking. He came home after that deployment and he couldn't unsee it. He walked into a coffee shop and he noticed the exits. He heard someone speaking another language and his entire nervous system activated, because that was training. Language recognition, threat assessment, attention that never really turns off. He tried to go back to normal. He'd tell you it didn't work. He'd tell you that you can train someone to be a certain kind of attentive, a certain kind of aware, and that training doesn't stop when you sign a discharge paper. Marcus had served the same way. Army interpreter, Arabic and Pashto and Dari. 14 years spread across 3 deployments. 3 times deploying to places where language was survival, where understanding what someone was really saying, not what they were translating, but what they meant beneath the translation, the context underneath the words, was the difference between keeping people alive and getting them killed. He was good at it. He was so good that he got classified. He was interpreting for commanders in the field. He was sitting in rooms where decisions were made that affected hundreds of people. He was the bridge between cultures and strategy and consequence. He was important. The first deployment was the learning deployment. You learn the language better. You learn the culture better. You learn how to read people whose communication style is different from yours. You learn that saying yes and meaning yes doesn't look the same across cultures. You learn that an interpreter isn't just translating words. You're translating intentions. You're reading between lines that were written in a different language in the first place. The second deployment was the competence deployment. You start getting clearance for more sensitive work. You interpret for meetings that matter. You interpret for intelligence operations. You interpret for decisions about which compounds to raid, which networks to disrupt, which people to recruit as assets. You're still translating words, but now you understand how heavy those words are. The third deployment was where something broke. Marcus didn't tell me what it was. He told me it involved a person, a translator's assistant, a young man who'd been helping him with some interpreting work. The details aren't important. I don't have them. But something happened in that deployment that made Marcus decide he couldn't do that work anymore. Something made him realize that being good at something doesn't mean you should keep doing it. That the weight you carry for being useful gets heavier the longer you carry it. That invisibility in the military context means one thing. You're behind the lines. You're protected. You're not a combatant. Invisibility in the world afterwards means something different. It means nobody knows what you've done. Nobody knows the burden. Nobody asks because they're not supposed to ask. He left the army. He left the classified work. He left the interpreting. He left his security clearance and his credentials and his resume that said, Army interpreter, 3 deployments, fluent in Arabic, Pashto, Dari, top secret clearance. He left all of it on purpose, and he went to work as a night shift janitor at County Hospital in Portland. And he became the person nobody asked about because he was the person nobody noticed. He became invisible on purpose. And the invisibility felt like safety. The invisibility felt like penance. The invisibility felt like the only way to not hurt anyone anymore. Now, here's what happens next. This is where the story gets complicated. This is where invisible people have to face the world recognizing them. And that recognition isn't always a gift. This is where the strategy that kept Marcus functioning got shattered by the sound of Arabic at 3:47 in the morning. The attending physician wanted to know everything. Who was this man? Where had he learned Arabic? The patient wanted to know his name. Sarah wanted to know why he'd never mentioned that he spoke languages. The hospital administrator, once she found out what had happened, wanted to know why the hospital had been walking past an Arabic interpreter for 3 years without knowing it. Marcus didn't want to answer. Not because he had anything to hide. Well, that's not quite true. He did have things to hide, but not from these people. He had things to hide because hiding was the strategy that allowed him to function. Because visibility, in his experience, meant questions. And questions meant stories. And stories meant processing the weight of what he'd done and who he'd been. Because being seen meant having to explain why someone who was qualified to be doing something much more important was mopping hallways instead. But he was already visible now. The algorithm had failed. The language barrier had shattered. The patient was alive. And everyone was looking at him with the sudden understanding that they'd been walking past someone extraordinary. The medical team changed their approach immediately. They stopped considering the medications they'd been planning. They ordered the right cardiac workup. They gave him the medications that wouldn't compound with a verapamil. His EKG showed some changes consistent with an old infarction, but nothing acute. No massive ST elevation. No sign of active MI. His troponin was slightly elevated, some myocardial damage, but not massive. His chest pain was real, but the cause wasn't acute infarction. It was cardiac stress, possibly induced by the anxiety of not being understood, possibly induced by some ischemia from his old scar tissue. But he was going to live. He was going to live because a man in a blue uniform stopped mopping and spoke Arabic. Sarah stood next to Marcus as the attending finished the new medication orders. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Not lightly, not casually. Like she understood what she'd almost done. Like she understood that Marcus had just reset the trajectory of this man's life from dead to alive. Marcus nodded. He was still looking at the patient. The patient was looking back at him, understanding. The patient stayed in the hospital for 3 days. His medical condition stabilized. His heart had been stressed. But the immediate danger had passed. He was monitored. He was supported. He was translated. Because now there was someone in the hospital who could do that. Now there was Marcus. Marcus visited him on the second day, not because he was required to, because he wanted to. He just sat in a chair next to the bed. They spoke in Arabic. The patient's name was Rashid. He was originally from Damascus. He'd come to the U.S. 15 years ago, bringing his family away from the instability and towards something safer. His English had eroded over those 15 years because his community spoke Arabic. His family spoke Arabic. His home spoke Arabic. He worked in construction. He spoke Arabic on the job sites. He spoke Arabic to his wife. He spoke Arabic to his grandchildren. He'd never needed English until the night his heart betrayed him and threw him into an institution where the language of healing was a language he'd let go of. Rashid asked Marcus where he was from. Marcus told him, "My family is from Lebanon, but I grew up in the United States." It was technically true. His parents had immigrated from Beirut when he was 3. He'd grown up speaking both languages at home. But he'd left that world far behind. They talked about Syria. Rashid told the story of leaving. It wasn't a dramatic story. It was a quiet story of a man who looked at the future and decided he didn't want his family living in it. He'd sold his business. He'd gotten visas. He'd come to Portland because his cousin was here, because Portland was far from everything he'd known. Because somewhere in America, he could rebuild. They talked about the patient's journey, about the weight of displacement. Rashid had been a successful man in Damascus. Here he was construction work in a small apartment and his children, who were becoming more American than Syrian. Rashid said, "My daughter, she doesn't speak Arabic properly now. She corrects me. She says I sound old. I tell her that's because I am old in her language." And Marcus, for the first time in 3 years, 5 months and 17 days, existed in a language that wasn't just communication. It was home. It was the language of his childhood. It was the language where he could hear his mother's voice, even though she'd been dead for 8 years. It was a place where he could be someone other than the person who carried classified secrets and military training. They spoke for an hour that second day. When Marcus left, Rashid held his hand for a moment. "Thank you," Rashid said in Arabic. "You gave me back my life." Marcus nodded. He couldn't speak. Something in his chest had opened that he'd locked down for a long time. On the third day, the hospital administrator appeared. She was a woman in her late 50s named Catherine. She'd worked at County Hospital for 20 years. She'd been there through the redesigns and the budget cuts and the changes in patient population. She'd never asked Marcus his name. She'd never asked what he did before he was a janitor. She'd just seen night shift janitor, reliable, shows up, does the job. Now she was seeing something else. Catherine wanted to talk to Marcus. Not angry, not suspicious. Curious, interested. She wanted to know his story. She wanted to know where he'd learned Arabic. She wanted to know why he hadn't told anyone. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was the tone of someone who just realized they'd been working with someone they didn't actually know. She wanted to know if he'd be willing to work in a different capacity. The hospital had never had an Arabic translator on staff. They contracted with services, expensive services that took 30 minutes to connect. Slow services that sometimes never arrived. Services that weren't available at 3:47 in the morning when a man's chest was failing and his language was breaking down. She wanted to know if he'd consider a position, not as a janitor, as a medical interpreter, full-time, salary, benefits, a room with a desk where people could find him when they needed translation. Catherine said, "You saved that man's life. And I'm guessing you could do that for other patients, too." Marcus said he'd think about it. It wasn't a no. It was also not a yes. It was the pause of someone who understood that this choice would change things. That visibility wasn't something he could take back. That once he stepped out of the invisibility he'd constructed, he couldn't step back into it. And here's what I want to tell you about that moment. Because my brother has stood in similar moments. Moments where the thing you've been hiding becomes the thing people suddenly want. Moments where the strategy that kept you alive becomes an opportunity. Moments where you have to decide if visibility is a gift or a trap. Moments where you realize that the weight you've been carrying might actually have meaning outside of the context where you were forced to carry it. Marcus had spent years becoming invisible because visibility in his previous life, his military intelligence life, had come with consequences. He'd translated things. He'd understood things. He'd been the bridge in conversations where the stakes were people's lives and national security and moral ambiguity that kept him awake at night. And somewhere in those 3 deployments, he'd learned that understanding too much, being trusted too deeply, carrying the weight of what you knew, that cost something. That it changed you, that it made you unable to unknow what you knew, that it made you responsible in ways you couldn't articulate to people who hadn't been there. So he'd erased it. He'd taken a job where nobody asked him anything, where he could exist in silence and motion, where the weight stayed compartmentalized in a separate part of him that he never had to access, where he could go home and not think about the conversations he'd translated, where he could sleep without remembering the faces of people whose fates had been decided by words he'd spoken in other languages. But the weight doesn't actually go away. It just settles. It collects in your chest like scar tissue. It waits. And then a man speaks Arabic in a hospital bed at 3:47 in the morning. And suddenly you remember why you carried it in the first place. Suddenly you remember that the reason you learned these languages, the reason you trained to understand, the reason you went through all of that, it was to help. It was to bridge. It was to make sure that people like this patient didn't die because they were lost in translation. It was, at its core, about this. About someone who couldn't speak their language of emergency being heard by someone who could. Marcus said yes to Catherine. He took the job. The hospital created a position. Medical interpreter, Arabic. He kept his benefits. He kept his access to the hospital, but he was no longer the invisible man mopping hallways, pushing a cart, keeping the infrastructure of the hospital clean while nobody noticed him. He was the man people asked for. The man people needed. The man whose past, his military service, his language training, his understanding of cultures and contexts, his ability to hear not just words, but meaning underneath words, became visible and relevant and valued. It was strange. It was terrifying. It was also necessary. Marcus's first week as a translator, he interpreted for 4 patients. An elderly man from Iraq who was having severe pain but couldn't describe it in English. A young woman from Lebanon who was pregnant and confused about her care. A child from Syria whose mother didn't speak any English and whose father was working 2 jobs and couldn't come to the hospital. Each interpretation was a moment where language broke down would have led to worse outcomes. Each interpretation was Marcus saving a life in slower motion than he'd saved Rashid's life. But saving lives nonetheless. And each one was proof that the thing he'd hidden wasn't dangerous in this context. It was necessary. It was the thing the hospital had needed all along. The patient recovered. 6 months later, Rashid came back to the hospital for a follow-up appointment, and he specifically asked to see Marcus. They spent an hour together. Rashid had learned some English. He'd been taking classes at the community center, he said. Wanted to be able to talk to his doctor without help. But he also wanted to see Marcus. He brought his wife. She spoke only Arabic. She hugged Marcus. She said, "You saved my husband. You saved my family." Marcus had been interpreting for other patients in the hospital for those 6 months, and each interpretation was a bridge. Each one was proof that the thing he'd hidden wasn't dangerous in this context. It was the exact opposite of dangerous. It was healing. But there was something else too. With each translation, Marcus was also translating himself. He was translating back from the person he'd constructed in the invisibility. He was reclaiming the parts of himself that he'd locked away. He was learning that the military training, the classified work, the weight he'd carried, it didn't have to stay weight. It could become useful. It could become healing. It could become the difference between a person dying in confusion and a person being understood. Here's what I know about living with a past that shapes you. My brother carries the weight of what he saw, what he learned, what he became in those 2 tours. He's not the same person who deployed. He's a different person with a military-shaped interior that he can't quite explain to people who weren't there. He understands language differently now. He understands attention differently. He understands the stakes of communication differently. He'll be at a family dinner and someone will speak a language that's not English and his entire nervous system will activate. He'll notice exits in rooms. He'll be aware of positions and sight lines. He'll listen not just to what people are saying, but to the weight underneath it. When he came home, he didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know if it was a liability or an asset. He took time. He did the work of processing with a therapist who understood military trauma. He eventually realized that the thing the military had built inside him, the attentiveness, the ability to read situations, the linguistic precision, the understanding that language carries meaning beyond words. It wasn't a curse. It was a tool, and tools can be used in different contexts. Tools can be put to work. Tools can have second lives. Marcus learned the same thing. The thing that made him invisible is the thing that makes him visible now. The training, the understanding, the ability to bridge linguistic and cultural gaps. That's not something you erase. That's something you choose what to do with. Marcus had chosen invisibility because he thought it was the only way to be safe. But what Rashid taught him, what that moment at 3:47 in the morning taught him, is that invisibility isn't safety. It's just invisibility. And sometimes, the thing you're trying to hide is the thing the world actually needs. The hospital ended up hiring a second interpreter within a year. They created protocols for language accessibility. They started recognizing that the night shift, the understaffed shift, the shift running on fumes, it was also the shift where communication most often broke down, where the smallest misunderstanding could cascade into medical error, where the absence of translation could kill people. They created a system where Marcus could be called in for critical translations, not just for Arabic, for the patients who arrived at 3:47 in the morning speaking languages the algorithm couldn't navigate, for the people whose mother tongue was their crisis language, for the moment when English failed and someone else needed to speak. The hospital brought Marcus into meetings about patient safety. They asked him how many times he thought a mistranslation could have caused problems. Marcus looked at the data, the number of Arabic-speaking patients, the number of times translation services had failed or been delayed, the number of patients who'd had adverse events in the presence of language barriers. And he said, every day, twice a day, 3 times on busy nights. And that's just Arabic. That's not Somali, Vietnamese, Mandarin, Korean, Spanish dialects that the algorithm gets wrong. That's not Pashto. That's not Dari. That's not the dozens of languages this hospital serves. Catherine looked at the data and made a decision. She expanded the interpreter program. She hired 2 more interpreters. She started training medical students to be aware of language barriers. She created a system where patients arriving without English fluency got flagged immediately, and Marcus or someone like him was called. The patient who'd come in asking for a chaplain became the catalyst for that change. He became, unknowingly, the reason that other patients with language barriers got the translation they needed. That's the ripple effect. One moment, one intervention, one invisible man becoming visible. And suddenly the institution has to reckon with how many invisible people they've been walking past. How many times the absence of someone like Marcus had cost lives or comfort or dignity. I think about my brother a lot. I think about the weight of carrying training and experience and understanding that people don't ask you about because they don't know it's there. I think about the exhaustion of being invisible by choice, by necessity, because visibility means questions and vulnerability and the weight of being seen. I think about the fact that he came home and had to figure out who he was when he wasn't useful in the way the military had made him useful. But I also think about the moments when invisibility breaks, when someone needs what you know, when the thing you were trained to do becomes the thing that matters. Those moments are complicated. They're not redemptive exactly. They're more like recognition, like the world finally seeing what you've been carrying all along, like understanding that the burden you were carrying had value, that the cost of it wasn't meaningless. Marcus saw something in that patient's eyes when he walked into that hospital room at 3:47 in the morning. He saw fear. He saw the desperation of not being understood. He saw the possibility of death because language had failed and time was running out, and the person whose chest was breaking was alone in a room full of people speaking a language he couldn't use. And Marcus made a choice. He stopped mopping. He became visible, and he saved a life. That's the story. That's what happens when invisible people are finally seen. That's what it costs to carry a past and what it means to choose, in a single moment, that the weight is worth bearing again. The patient, Rashid, lives in Portland now, 3 neighborhoods over from the hospital. He sees Marcus occasionally. They sit in coffee shops and speak in Arabic and English. Marcus told him, eventually, about his military service. The fact that he'd been an interpreter, that he'd deployed 3 times, that he'd spent years speaking languages of war. Rashid understood without needing explanation. He'd seen the same thing in other people he'd known in his own country. The weight of having lived in a different world. The weight of knowing languages that meant life and death. Rashid asked Marcus why he'd left that work. Marcus said, "I got tired." That was the simplest version. Rashid nodded like he understood exactly what Marcus meant. "I got tired too," Rashid said. "That's why I came here. Look, I'm telling you this story because Code Whisperers is about the people nobody talks about. It's about the systems that contain extraordinary people doing invisible work. It's about the moments when that invisibility breaks and the world has to reckon with what it's been taking for granted. It's about the fact that hospitals employ people with classified military training and nobody asks. That translation matters. That the absence of someone who can bridge languages can be a form of institutional violence. Marcus is back in the world now. He's visible. He's valued. He's bridging the gap between languages and cultures and medical care. Every time a patient speaks Arabic in that hospital, there's someone there who understands not just the words, but the context, the fear, the desperation, the need, the medical information hidden in the native language, the story underneath the symptoms. My brother told me something last month. He said, "The thing nobody tells you about carrying training like that, it doesn't go away. You don't stop seeing the patterns. You don't stop understanding the stakes. But you do get to choose what you do with it. You can hide it, or you can use it. And using it, that's different than carrying it." That's what Marcus learned. That's what the hospital learned. That's what happens when someone stops mopping and becomes visible. That's what happens when the thing you've been trained to do is suddenly needed by someone whose life depends on it. The patient is okay. His follow-up visits 6 months later showed his heart recovering from the stress. His ejection fraction is normal. He's back to construction work. He's on his blood pressure medication. He's alive because someone heard his Arabic at 3:47 in the morning. Marcus is okay. He's been working as a translator for 18 months now. He's interpreting for patients every day. He's also doing other things, teaching medical students about cultural competency, consulting on cases, helping the hospital understand its language barriers. He's doing what he was trained to do, but in a context where it heals instead of harms, where the weight has a different shape. And somewhere out there, right now, there's another person speaking in a language nobody understands, admitted to an ER at an hour when everything is underwater and desperate. And because of what happened that night at 3:47 in the morning, because Marcus stopped mopping, because the hospital recognized what was right in front of them, someone's going to bridge that gap. Someone's going to translate not just words, but meaning. Someone's going to make sure that invisible people don't die because they can't speak the language of their own emergency. That's the story. That's what I came here to tell you. That's why we talk about people like Marcus. That's why it matters.